Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. What a pleasure to see you here. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which, as you may know, and maybe you as well, is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful. We can all recite it along together on this lovely Philadelphia day. This is, as always, an exciting time at the National Constitution Center here in constitutional heaven. We announced yesterday that the 2015 Liberty Medal will go next October to the Dalai Lama. That follows the historic visit of Pope Francis to Philadelphia in September, and we are going to mark it here at the Constitution Center with a fall devoted to the history and contemporary meaning of religious liberty. We're opening a new exhibit with rare treasures of religious liberty, including George Washington's first Thanksgiving proclamation and his letter to the Roman Catholics and Jews and Baptists of America. We're going to have symposia and discussions about religious liberty all fall, and it's going to be a thrilling time. We have also just opened a wonderful exhibit that I hope you'll stop by and see on your way out called Speaking Out for Equality. It talks about the history of LGBT rights in the courts, and it opens just weeks before the Supreme Court will hand down an important decision about same-sex marriage, and that is a very great opportunity for debates as well. Our traveling town hall series continues. I've just come back from New York City where the night before last, and some of you were there, we had a phenomenal debate co-sponsored by the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society about whether or not NSA metadata surveillance is unconstitutional. Michael Mukasey, the former Attorney General, debated Deborah Pearlstein of Cardozo Law School. General Mukasey won the debate because he experienced a 10% raise in support for his constitutional position, but a majority nevertheless favored Deborah Pearlstein's position, so it was a wonderfully balanced bipartisan debate. And these town hall debates are going across America next fall to Grand Rapids and Chicago and San Francisco, and they're very exciting indeed. And finally, here in Philadelphia, we've got some great events coming up. On July 8th, our Supreme Court review. Ladies and gentlemen, the court this morning issued a series of really important decisions, including one holding that Texas does not have to display the Confederate flag on its license plates. We'll be discussing that in our We the People podcast this afternoon, which we'll publish later today. All month we're talking about the Supreme Court decisions, and we will review them on July 8th with Erwin Chemerinsky and Fred Lawrence. All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for a really wonderful discussion, and I am so pleased to introduce, for the first time, a very special guest moderator. This is my good friend Alexander Heffner. Alexander is the co-host of what is the longest-running show on public television. It has been running for almost 60 years, because Alexander Heffner's grandfather, Richard Heffner, who was a dear friend and really one of the great communicators, scholars of public broadcasting, and interviewers of all time, who just passed away last year. He ran that show for almost 58 years, and this is one of the great figures of American life, a public intellectual, a dear, decent man, a great friend. I'm so honored to take this moment to mark his memory. He's badly missed, but Alexander, he would be so proud, has taken up the torch and is continuing to host the Open Mind on public TV, which will host its 60th anniversary soon. Check out the Open Mind website and you will see the first shows dating back to interviews with Martin Luther King and Albert Schweitzer in the 1950s. It's an extraordinary run. It's great to welcome him to our stage. He has a distinguished background. Before becoming host of the Open Mind, he founded Scoop 08 and Scoop 44. He's written for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. He's a Fitzwater Fellow at Franklin Pierce University for the next presidential campaign and co-author of A Documentary History of the United States. And he will be interviewing our great scholar today, David Sehat. Professor Sehat is a cultural and intellectual historian of the US. He teaches at Georgia State University. He writes broadly on American intellectual, political, and cultural life. He's the author previously of The Myth of American Religious History from Oxford University Press, which won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians, and we hope to get him back for our religious liberty focus in the fall. And today he joins us to discuss the Jefferson Rule, how the Founding Fathers became infallible and our politics inflexible. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Alexander Hefner and David Sehat.
David.
Alexander.
It's great to meet you. Thanks so much for being here today. On behalf of the center and Jeff, I just want to thank him for his acknowledgement of my grandfather, too. David has written a wonderful book. I don't know if you read The Inquirer this past week, but there was a story, an anecdote that he recounted that really gets at the heart of, I think, what he's trying to illuminate here. It's a narrative historiography, but before going any further, David, I want to ask you, what is the Jefferson Rule?
The Jefferson Rule is the idea that all of our politics must in some ways be tied to and justified by the Founding Fathers. And it's a rule that I'm an historian and I've read pretty much all of American political history that I can get my hands on. And it's a rule that's been operative for almost all of American politics, and it's operative today. And you referenced this Inquirer story. When the book was coming out, I was invited by a group to Dallas, and they said they wanted to bring me out and have me address a group of donors, and I thought, fantastic. And I went to the website and found on their Twitter feed that they had quoted Jefferson, and that's great. I love that. Except that in this case, the quotation was entirely fabricated. It was a quotation that you see kind of circulating in various political circles. And so I was kind of concerned, and the more I read, the more I realized, this group is kind of ideologically rigid, and I'm a little concerned that maybe they don't understand what my book is about. So I went through some sort of tortured struggle, and then I decided, well, I'll accept. And I wrote them and said I'd love to do it. But just to make sure, this is the argument of my book. And I never heard from them again. Radio silence. And I think that's illustrative of the rule, because the problem that I have with the rule is that it shuts down political debate. And that what happens when a politician says the Founding Fathers thought fill in the blank means I'm right and you're wrong and you're dangerous. And so I'm going to resist you at all costs. And I think we saw that in that incident.
Well, as a very structured, coherent historian, your concluding sentence of this first chapter, this introduction, really is the essence of the thesis. To just expound, you write, in the end, Jefferson's triumph consolidated the founding moment and handed to his successors an interpretive stance toward the founding era that would become the norm. He rhetorically turned the founding era into one of political purity that he himself had channeled. First of all, Jefferson as pure. Mm-hmm. We could ask our friend Annette Gordon-Reed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But seriously, he was a man of nuance, and he was a tortured soul in some respect. So before even reading the last sentence, or the second to last sentence of this paragraph, the norm and a departure from that norm as antithetical to the values of this country. So, in its purest form, what was the norm?
That Jefferson was appealing to, or that
what was the precedent? We talk about Washington as setting precedents, but
right.
You're arguing, really,
is Jefferson
that in terms of the political and public discourse of this country, it was Jefferson.
Yeah. When I first started sort of getting concerned about the way that the Founding Fathers were being used in American political debate, I'd finished my first book, and my first book I had read a lot of the Founding Fathers, and then about that time the 2009 Tea Party began, and I thought, where is this coming from? Because many of the invocations of the Founding Fathers didn't accord with what I knew about the Founding Fathers. So I kind of read back, and I read all the way to Jefferson, and what I found was that in other debates with the Founding Fathers, what Jefferson had done was he was the very first to wrap himself in the founding. He spoke of the true principles of the Revolution. He said that his opponents were engaged in political heresy while he was affirming political orthodoxy. He used things like, or phrases like, our political creed. And what happened was when he successfully won and came into the presidency in the election of 1800, he took this pattern of wrapping politics in these founding principles, and he kind of made that an essential part of American political debate. And from that point forward, what happened was that people would fight over Jefferson, because it was Jefferson's party that became the single party system from 1800 to 1824. And then once the founders had died off, then they just referred to a kind of unified founding fathers that was supposed to justify policies in the present. And it was really Jefferson that started that with his election in 1800, and we still see it today.
To continue now, henceforth, if Jefferson had his way, American politics would be fought by seeking a connection to Jefferson, and through him to the founders. Any innovation would, of necessity, require politicians to show that their policies were in line with the principles of the past, and it would go without saying that a departure from Jeffersonianism, now equated with the principles of the founders, and dare I say freedom or liberty, represented the beginning of a national degeneracy. But Jefferson himself was nuanced. So from the 1820s onward, do you think the nuance was diluted into this kind of nebula of liberty?
You know, I would say actually more strongly that Jefferson was tortured and contradictory. Jefferson was a proponent of small government and a proponent, he would say, of liberty, which was protected by the states as opposed to the federal government. But once in power, he became a nationalist. He adopted wholesale many parts of his opponent's political system. So much so that when people talk about Jefferson, sometimes they talk about the political sphinx. Sometimes they talk about, they ask what are the principles that he believed in, because there's almost nothing that he didn't sort of contradict himself at one point in time or another. And so even if you kind of reduce the Jefferson Rule to trying to apply the principles of Thomas Jefferson, it's nearly impossible, because Jefferson changed his mind, he contradicted himself, and there's no kind of set of principles that you can get a hold of and say, this is what it is that I'm defending, this is the true principles of the nation.
And therefore, in contemporary times, that's why it's so difficult, and why you expose not necessarily hypocrites, but the unreasoned or less reasonable justifications in employing the founders or Jefferson specifically. Just to backtrack a bit, I'm interested in how you carry forward this from Andrew Jackson. So if we were to take it step by step, how is Jefferson transmitted or transposed, if you will, in the tenure of Andrew Jackson?
So Jackson is an interesting figure, because Jackson, as some of you may know, came into kind of public life as a general. He ran for presidency in 1824, and he lost, even though he won the plurality of the vote, the popular vote and the electoral college vote. He lost because when there's no majority in the electoral college, then the vote goes to the House of Representatives. And in the House picked John Quincy Adams, and Jackson was outraged. Jackson then spent the next 4 years kind of cultivating a political persona as the heir of Jefferson. And he came into office then in 1828 proclaiming that he was going to defend Jeffersonian principles. But what happened was almost immediately Jeffersonianism fragmented, and there were parts of Jackson's party, led primarily by his vice president, John C. Calhoun, who took Jeffersonianism as a defense of nullification, the ability of states to nullify federal law, and ultimately as a defense of Southern slavery. And Jacksonianism then fractured, and the nation began to kind of careen toward war. And this happened most clearly in the nullification crisis of 1830, where you see both Jackson, John C. Calhoun, and the nationalists of the period all invoking Thomas Jefferson to wildly different ends. John C. Calhoun said Jefferson was the one that came up with nullification. Jackson said Jefferson is a nationalist and you're betraying him. And then the nationalists of the period, who would soon become the Whigs, said the founding fathers were consolidationists. They were nationalists, much more stronger than even Jefferson, and you are all betraying him. And the nation entered a period of constitutional crisis that would really continue all the way up until the Civil War.
Do you, just stepping back, do you attribute his status, Jefferson's, to the authorship of the Declaration, or is, in terms of being poised to almost usurp intellectually, and in terms of the prominence of the statues, Washington?
Well, so the Declaration is important, but I actually attribute Jefferson's prominence to actually the formation of political parties. Because when he won the election in 1800, the opposing party was the Federalists, and the Federalists essentially disappeared. They were utterly obliterated and went into decline, and there was no more Federalists by 1812 or so, or shortly thereafter. And what happened was that was the end of the first party system. And then with the beginning of the second party system, where you have the National Republicans and then the Democratic Republicans, which was the party of Jackson, both of them looked back to Jefferson as the original heir of their party and the one that they were defending. And then when the National Republicans became the Whigs, and then the Whigs went away, then the Republicans, which is the heir of present-day Republicans, they too, and this is the party of Lincoln, went back to Jefferson and said, we are the true heirs of Thomas Jefferson, and they invoked the Declaration of Independence and said, the Declaration clearly says that all men are created equal, and that's why slavery is bad. And so it's a little bit of the Declaration, but it's even more this kind of party dynamic that emerged in the antebellum era.
And I trust that gets more complicated with Lincoln as you write. But I'm interested now in your attribution to political parties here, pointing to the formation of these parties, because the one area in which your thesis validates Jefferson in a sense, and when you read about the way that you write that, and I learned this in the book, Andrew Jackson, in challenging the second Adams, Quincy, employed some of the same tactics that Jefferson did to ensure that John, Quincy's father, was a one-termer.
Right, yeah.
And I found that fascinating. But it was really in the pursuit of power that both Jefferson and Jackson, it seems, used tactics that we might deem today as uncivil.
That's exactly right. When I see, I've read a lot of American political debate, and when you see the Founding Fathers come up, what you see often is people out of power who are criticizing those in power, and they're using the Founding Fathers as a political weapon. And it's a very, very useful and very, very powerful political weapon, because what it suggests is that your opponents don't have different policy visions or different priorities, but they're fundamentally usurping the foundational principles of the nation. And so the chief response is massive political mobilization, resistance at all costs, and ultimately coming into political power. And so in almost every case, and you see this is very, very clear before the Civil War, when politicians are talking about the founders, they're not just using it as a political weapon, but it's a kind of a symbol of deep political dysfunction. And it's a kind of a way of trying to get power so that they can install their own vision.
And Jefferson wasn't the cure of that political dysfunction.
No, Jefferson was in many ways the cause of the political dysfunction. Yeah.
So that's the irony of the situation. I thought maybe we'd pause before looking at Jefferson through history. We've gone from Jefferson to Jackson, and we might take a stop in Lincoln and ultimately Roosevelt in the contemporary times. But I want to just get this 800-pound gorilla out of the way. Is there any way in the contemporary climate, I was asking you in the green room, and you were mulling it over, that our politicians can be accountable for greater rigor in their understanding or evaluation of Jefferson, and if there are any circumstances under which you would accept attribution and without historiography or a scholarly paper. Are there any politicians now who you think are doing it right?
No.
Okay. So we'll stick with we'll stick with the past.
And the reason why, though, is that one thing that you learn if you read the Founding Fathers, and you see it just immediately, is that they were in deep, deep disagreement with one another. The founding era was the most partisan era, short of maybe the Civil War era, in American political history. And so the sentence, the Founding Fathers thought, fill in the blank, is in almost every case false, just flat out. And the ways in which, if you said that you could kind of intellectually say that, the Founding Fathers thought that women shouldn't be part of the political process, that would be true, but you would never hear anybody say that. The Founding Fathers thought that political parties are bad, that would be true, and then they formed the first political parties. And so there's almost no scenario in which, in a kind of soundbite of modern politics, that you could ever utter that phrase and it have any kind of intellectual credibility.
What about our jurists? Do they have intellectual credibility?
I would never impugn the intellectual credibility of the jurists.
Especially not here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this is the interesting thing, is that part of the reason that the Founding Fathers have continued political salience is the Constitution, and the Constitution remains with us. But the Constitution is different than the Founding Fathers. And one of the central points of disagreement between the Founding Fathers was over the true meaning and proper mode of interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. And so in a way, if we're going to debate the Constitution, let's debate the Constitution. But in a certain sense, the Founding Fathers aren't the place to solve that, because they deeply disagreed about it as well.
Well, we might point to two departures within that disagreement where a persuasion that might have been opposed to Jefferson's prevailed. Lincoln and Roosevelt. And obviously the Republican Party in many sense became the Democratic Party by the time Roosevelt served his 4 terms. But take us through that voyage of Jefferson as political hero, or to some maybe villain, as we move now from the antebellum to wartime.
So, when the Republican Party was formed, this is in 1854, and it was after the Whig Party had dissolved under the pressures of what would become the Civil War. And the Republican Party was the party of anti-slavery, and in particular, the party that wanted to limit slavery from the Western territories. And that party explicitly looked back to Thomas Jefferson as its kind of founding father. But their Thomas Jefferson was the anti-slavery Thomas Jefferson, not the Thomas Jefferson that owned slaves. And so that party then was eventually led by Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was obsessed with the Founding Fathers. He referred to the Founding Fathers in speeches all the time. He referred to the Declaration of Independence all the time. And his Founding Fathers were anti-slavery visionaries who wanted to limit slavery, who didn't want to necessarily abolish it overnight because they didn't see a way to, but who wanted to limit it and then eventually have it kind of go away. And going up to the Civil War, Lincoln pressed this argument over and over and over again. And under the pressures of war, what happened was, once the war began, he kept saying, I want the Union as it was. And then once he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, suddenly he stopped talking about the Union as it was. And he started saying things like, I want a new birth of liberty. He said that, of course, in the Gettysburg Address. In 1862, when he was planning the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, the quiet dogmas of the stormy past are inadequate to our the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to our stormy present. We must think anew, and we must act anew. And that kind of turn toward self-determination in the present, the ceasing of looking to the founding fathers, that became characteristic of post-war American political culture. And you saw that especially in Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt, you may remember, came into office during the Great Depression. And what he said in his Democratic nomination acceptance speech is, "Let us all here constitute ourselves prophets of a new order." That was the kind of the bookends of this moment, which was a departure from the Jefferson Rule, where politicians basically stopped looking to the founding fathers because after the experience of war, they started to believe that founders' rhetoric was dangerous and wasn't going to help anything. And you see a kind of whole different kind of political debate. And that would eventually go away during the Roosevelt administration when he faced significant criticism from conservative activists, and then he began to talk about the founding fathers as well, and thereby began a kind of modern fight over the founding fathers that's still with us.
National renewal. I'm glad you connected Lincoln to Roosevelt. There was something in terms of our own salvation and the way in which Roosevelt revolutionized in that span of time politics. There was a yearning for certainly solidarity, a leader who was not going to flail in the wind like Herbert Hoover, but the absence of the Jefferson Rule or the deviation, aberration, is it too simplistic to say that there was grave depression, a Great Depression, and that instead of searching into the lexicon of Thomas Jefferson, we created a new lexicon? Is that the way we should interpret it? Is that the way you interpret it?
I would say that actually, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. I would say that Franklin Roosevelt was the heir to progressivism, and progressivism was a political movement that began at the beginning of the 20th century. And if you go back and you read progressives, what you find is that they believed that the nation had changed so dramatically by the beginning of the 20th century that the founding fathers couldn't possibly speak to the condition of the nation as it existed in their present. You know, this was an America of skyscrapers and of deep industrial concentration. And Roosevelt took that progressive impulse, and when confronted with the problems of the Great Depression, took it even further and said that, you know, not only is our kind of nation physically different, but the economic structures, our entire pattern of life, it's not possible to look to the founding fathers for answers. And so he used that opportunity to then create.
But he never said it. He never said to the nation, "It's not possible to look to the founding fathers for answers." But you cited the quote that you read here when you came to the center.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we're talking.
Theodore you're talking
Roosevelt.
Theodore.
I was
okay.
thinking. I was talking.
Well,
Franklin
the genesis
Roosevelt,
of. Okay. Well, I wonder how that transformation occurred, because you're saying it began with Theodore.
I'm saying it began after the Civil War. It got taken up by Theodore
in
Roosevelt.
what we consider the progressive age.
Exactly, and then was moved forward in the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But do you think that there was a palpable, based on what you read in the oratory of Roosevelt and kind of
which one are we talking about?
FDR.
FDR.
Let's
Okay.
do TR. Let's do TR and
Okay.
FDR.
All right.
In the sort of cultural milieu that and the sickness of the country, it incited a new formula, which did grow on the legacy of progressivism from TR's age. But the pendulum that was the swinging away from the Jefferson Rule, this is where I find it particularly interesting. Was it swinging towards Hamilton? Was it swinging towards Adams? I want to talk about this because in recent years there's been thanks to David McCullough and Tom Hanks HBO series, there's been a revitalization of Adams, if
Right.
you will. So
Yeah.
was FDR, of course, the folks on talk radio of the era would say it was, Bolshevik and what preceded that, but was there, to the Jefferson Rule for FDR, another kind of rule that could be legitimately couched in historical terms?
I don't think so, in the sense that, so Hamilton and Jefferson are often the two founding fathers that are contrasted. And in popular imagination, Jefferson is the small government Republican, and Hamilton is the kind of the big government Democrat in 1790 or whenever. But the problem there is that kind of imperfectly works because it's just a vastly different era. And if you go back, what Hamilton was talking about in many ways was supporting capitalism. He was at the very beginning of this capitalist revolution and at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so in certain senses, he kind of looks like a Republican, and in other senses, not. And if you go back and you look at Jefferson, in many ways, he's an agrarian, and he's in some ways very anti-capitalist. And so I get kind of concerned when people want to kind of bring these figures in the present and say, well, wasn't FDR kind of more Hamiltonian? I don't think so, because Hamilton is just so different, and he lived so long ago, and the issues were so different. I like to think that the beginning of New Deal government is something very new, and I like to take
his creation.
Yeah, and I like to take FDR at his word. He considered himself a prophet of a new political order, and I think he created that new political order.
Well, and so bold and persistent experimentation.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
remember, he, as Richard Hofstadter points out, he wanted the survival of capitalism, and often, as you testify to later in the book, in the examination of the Tea Party and the current occurrence within the contemporary GOP, you would think that FDR wanted to obliterate capitalism as we know it. He wanted to enable competition, real competition. So in answering that question, I think you're saying to all of us that it's not fair to say that there was an Adams rule or a Hamilton rule, but in the context, to keep this lively and timely, Alexander Hamilton, soon to be removed from the $10 bill. Would that I was going to ask you if that would be justified. but seriously, when contemporary policymakers get involved in decisions like that, how does it faze you? What is
whether Hamilton should or shouldn't be
I
involved?
think the latest is that he's going to share it with a woman. I don't know why the woman couldn't have it herself, but that's on the level of, in a certain sense, I'm inclined to sort of dismiss that as not very important, and then in another sense, it is important in the sense that it's symbolically important. And we revere the founders, and the kind of the fact that they appear in sort of standardized form on all our money can make us believe that they were kind of all basically the same and in agreement. And so, if you're asking me as a citizen, what do I think should happen? I support the diversification of our money. But there's only so many bills to go around, and so. So then, how do you explain if born out of FDR's four terms was a radical departure?
Yeah.
How do you explain the pendulum turning back from LBJ through Reagan, despite the Great Society, despite the fact that LBJ was working from the Roosevelt rule?
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, LBJ didn't justify the Great Society under a different criteria than Roosevelt and claim the mantle of the founders. There was a new history.
Right.
And ever since he shook Roosevelt's hand in Texas after the Dust Bowl, he was marching forward. So what happened in terms of our rhetoric and culture, between Roosevelt and Johnson, and then ultimately Johnson and Reagan?
I mean, I think the most important thing was the growth of conservatism, which began in the New Deal era. And the conservatives that I'm talking about were among the richest men in the nation. There was the DuPont family, the head of the GM. And they formed together in what's known as the American Liberty League. And the American Liberty League, I went and I read their planning documents. And as these men were forming the American Liberty League, what they were concerned about was that Roosevelt was turning to socialism. That was forthrightly their concern, and that the New Deal was nothing other than socialism under another name.
And were they using Jefferson to?
No. Well, not yet. Not in the planning documents. But what they did say was they said that we don't want to refer to the protection of property, though, because that would be stupid in a time of Great Depression. You know, that's going to turn off the common man. And what we need is a mass movement. So what we can do and what we need to do is make this an issue of the Constitution. And this is all in these documents. And they said, you know, parenthetically, of course, we actually do want to change the Constitution. We want to repeal the 16th Amendment, which allows for an income tax. But for our purposes right now, we don't want to change the Constitution. We revere the Constitution. We protect the Constitution against its enemies. And we are going to use the Founding Fathers. And so what you saw when the American Liberty League was formed was this constant reference to the Founding Fathers. And the American Liberty League, of course, lost, and it disbanded by 1940. But the kind of sons of these businessmen continued, and they began looking around. They continued on a kind of lower level. And in the 1850s, they found Ronald Reagan. And Reagan was at that point, a kind of a faded B-list actor. He was the head of General Electric Theater, but he was a superb communicator, and he was becoming more and more conservative. And in 1964, with the beginning of, or kind of toward the end of the Goldwater campaign, they found Reagan and they said, we want you to give a speech in support of Barry Goldwater's candidacy. And he gave a very famous speech that was broadcast on national television called A Time for Choosing. And this is the beginning of the modern conservative concern for the Founding Fathers. Because if you go back and you listen to that speech, it's on YouTube. You can just type in Reagan, A Time for Choosing. And you see a very, very powerful Jeremiad in which Reagan is saying the Founding Fathers had certain principles. We've departed from those principles, and now the nation is headed toward ruin. And Goldwater, of course, lost disastrously. But Reagan was a shining star. And with the ascent of Ronald Reagan, that became an ascent of kind of founders' rhetoric in American politics. And by 1980, when Reagan came into the office, the conservative obsession with the Founding Fathers was more or less complete.
So you're telling us there was a second set of Sons of Liberty.
There was, yes.
And they were rebelling against Roosevelt.
And they were rebelling against Roosevelt using the sort of the Jeffersonian tactic of invoking the Founding Fathers, exactly.
How have your peers in the field responded to this thus far?
Well, you know the way that academic discourse works is that you publish a book and like 2 years later you finally get some reviews in academic journals. So they haven't responded yet.
Well, I asked because on the show that I hosted, I had Tom Foster, who you might have had some exchanges with, who also wrote a book that, in a sense, humanizes the founders, sexing the Founding Fathers. So, do you see your ultimate objective here as enhancing political discourse of the present through a richer adaptation in the way that we're retracing the roots of these men?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an historian, so I believe in the political relevance of history and of the past. Not just political relevance, just the relevance of history in the past. But I'm concerned about the way in which I hear history, in kind of pseudo-history often, in American political debate. And so what I'm trying to do is to offer a history here that says, look at the long pattern of dispute over the Founding Fathers. What are its consequences? And I think if you look at this long pattern of dispute, what you see are the consequences are negative. That founders' rhetoric generates hardened political sides. That founders' rhetoric comes along with intellectual dishonesty. That founders' rhetoric kind of debases American political debate. And so the end goal, of course, I can't stop politicians from doing whatever they want to do. But so long as this rhetoric works, it will be used. And so I want to point out, maybe why it shouldn't.
Well, I don't know if you folks follow PolitiFact. I think the Inquirer has a relationship with PolitiFact, but the St. Pete Times, formerly, now the Tampa Bay Times, founded. You could do a PolitiFact geared around when Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush invokes the founders, but there's not a credible basis on which they're doing so. I think it's something maybe to consider. And you talk here, about a fantasy politics. Before we take questions, my last one is, so if Jefferson himself was debased or debasing, and when we look at the U.S. Congress today or President Obama and see the modern manifestations of the Jefferson Rule, where do you see it most problematically, and where do you see the opportunity to resurrect some real history?
I think the Jefferson Rule reaches its most disturbing terminus when you see militia groups out in the Southwest saying that we've so fundamentally departed from the Founding Fathers that they create their own flag and they're leading secessionist movements. And I guess I'm not sure that I trust any modern politician to do history. And so I suppose I would just say, I would love it if they would stop, and then we could debate our policies in the present and just keep the debate about policy rather than the past.
So let's take a question here. Can you discuss the ways in which citing the founders is important to our founding story? In other words, the way that the founders clarify and bind us together rather than distract and divide.
Oh, I see. The Founding Fathers are, like many things, like the flag, I suppose, like the Constitution, or they can be, symbols of national unity. But I think that if you see how the founders are represented often in political debate, they're not images of national unity or symbols of national unity. They're political weapons. And I suppose I'm uncomfortable with the idea of people as symbols because I don't think people make very good symbols. And so if we're looking for symbols of national unity, I think I would propose that we go with the flag or we go with the Constitution, an impersonal object, rather than people who we're often inventing in order to make them appropriate symbols for whatever it is that we want.
Another viewer, listener,
they're
viewing too. The founders never thought they had all the answers. So the real question is what they expected, told future generations to do. So I guess what you were saying in your last answer is it's unhelpful to, as we as a society seem to ceaselessly do, what would Jefferson do? What would Adams do? Are those questions unhelpful?
I think those questions are unhelpful because how would you know? I'm not sure I would know. That's the thing about people. I'm not sometimes sure what my wife would do. I don't necessarily know how I would know what somebody who's been dead 200 years would do.
And isn't an argument possibly to expound on that sure there was the Enlightenment and Magna Carta, but and Mayflower, but these men saw their own imperfections, and in order to create a more perfect union, they innovated.
Yeah.
They did their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the Constitution, and what the Constitution, as you know, begins "We the people." And the thing about "we the people" is it's always changing, and it's not "we the founding fathers." It's "we the people." And so, in a certain sense, if you want to think, well, what would the founding fathers do? I still basically don't think that you can really answer that question. But if you start with the premise that they created a constitution, and the authority of that constitution comes from the people themselves, and the people is ever renewing, then one answer to that question would be, we the people would solve the problems of the present, whatever those problems would be, and however distant those problems are from whatever problems existed in 1787 when the Constitution itself was created. And I like this idea of put forward by this law scholar at Yale, Jack Balkin, and it's called Framework Originalism. And what Balkin says was that the Founding Fathers, through the Constitution, created a structure for politics and a structure for problem solving. And then the Constitution doesn't mean kind of anything that we want it to mean. I mean, we still have elections for presidents every 4 years. We still have elections for representatives and for some senators every 2 years. And that structure is basically in place. But that within that structure, there's a tremendous amount of latitude, and that the particular meanings of the Constitution are fleshed out through Supreme Court decisions, and it happens over time. And sometimes he calls it living constitutionalism or framework originalism, or he has various things. But I like that idea that the founders established a framework that they then gave to subsequent generations, and it's the role of those subsequent generations to kind of work through the problems however they see fit, which might even mean changing the Constitution, but nevertheless continuing the process of American political development.
What about that point of changing the Constitution? We are here at this beautiful institution, and it tends to be very controversial. Mm-hmm. And Sandy Levinstein, for example, and Larry Sabato, a lawyer and a historian, there are professors in this choir that the dysfunction and what you suggest in the subtitle, the inflexibility, right? Yeah. I'm not going to ask what would Jefferson do. if Jefferson thought it would be useful to, I'm tempted. Yeah. But how do we embark on that decision-making process when it seems like the rigor of our public discourse is not going to satisfy the basic requirement for having enough knowledge as a citizenry to be able to convene a new constitutional convention? Yeah. But yet it would be so inspiring. How do you weigh in on this? And bring in the history as you want to.
I mean, so, Levinson is an interesting character. He's a law professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's among the foremost proponents of a new constitution. And what he argues is that the 18th century constitution is fundamentally flawed in lots of ways, and that a lot of the pathologies of modern politics arise out of trying to live under a document that's now two centuries old. And he makes some compelling cases. For example, that the Senate, which is a fundamentally anti-democratic institution by design, can never be changed under the provisions of the U.S. Constitution. That was sort of written in at the last minute. And so you can't even by amendment say we want to apportion representation in the Senate in a truly representative manner. You have to have a new constitutional convention. And I think he makes some interesting points. I mentioned this to some of my colleagues at an event that I had one time, and I said, he has some good arguments. And he said, can you imagine? And the colleague that I was talking to said, could you imagine what would come out of a constitutional convention that we convene today? That is utterly insane. And it might be, but wouldn't it be an interesting exercise? I mean, I don't think anybody would have imagined that.
But does Sandy, and thank you for giving the audience proper context on that. I apologize for omitting. But Sandy has a savvier answer than that, right? Not just that it would be an exercise.
No,
does he not?
No. As far as I know, he has graduate students, or whenever he teaches a law class, they sit around and they come up with their own kind of version of the Constitution. And I think he's more optimistic than I am about what would emerge from that.
Well, let's talk about that, because one misappropriation, but I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, accurate quotation of Jefferson's was about a new rebellion.
Right.
What was it precisely?
X
decades,
it was like
X years.
It was something like every 20 years, we need a new
but
revolution.
So how do you assess that is a mantra of the Tea Party?
Yeah.
So if the Tea Party employed its energies to
coming up with a new constitution.
Right, then
Yeah.
you might see some of the outcomes you're projecting. But I'm wondering, because that quote, maybe more than any other Jefferson quote, has had the most traction
Right.
in this contemporary political climate.
Yeah. The Tea Party, I'll confess, it doesn't, as a political movement, make much sense to me, because on the one hand, they do kind of invoke this revolutionary idea that you see from Jefferson, and many of the leaders of the Tea Party conceive of their movement as a reclamation of this revolutionary spirit. And at the same time, they have this very nostalgic view of the past. It's like they're nostalgic revolutionaries or something like that. And as a kind of intellectual posture, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. But I would love it if the Tea Party, if there was a Tea Party convention sometime and they sat around and said, what do we want a new Constitution to look like? And I think it would be the Constitution without all the amendments. Certainly without the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct election of U.S. senators. I know that many Tea Party proponents are opposed to that.
But they just want the Bill of Rights and no Constitution, or it's a conundrum, because you referred to Jefferson as a farmer. Did Jefferson have a corporate overlord? No, right? I mean,
No.
And again, this is a nonpartisan institution, and this is not a partisan point, because the Democratic Party and certainly Hillary Clinton and the Clinton Foundation have overlords, right?
Yeah, right.
As does the Tea Party.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it just goes to the fundamental incoherence of references to the Founding Fathers. I mean, I was working on this book in 2012 when Barack Obama was elected, and I remember listening to his acceptance speech on the night of his re-election, and he said something to the effect of, now we can go about achieving the dream of the Founding Fathers, the idea that it doesn't matter, who you are or where you come from or who you love, a kind of, gesture to gay rights, but America has a place for you. And I thought, like, the Founding Fathers, I mean, a plurality of them owned slaves, and would not believe that Barack Obama, as a black man, could be president of the United States. And so there is this just really deep level of historical malapropism every time a politician or a political activist references the Founding Fathers, and it kind of goes, all ways, Republican, Democrat. It's often very confused.
Not enough Democrats acknowledge, though, both in Bill Clinton's administration and in the present administration, the fact that the triangulation led very much forward the Reagan Revolution, if you will, which maybe we shouldn't call the Reagan Revolution, because if the Revolution of 1800 and then later with Jackson were the real revolutions, then Roosevelt's was an aberration, not a revolution, and shouldn't, and Reagan's was, furthering the real origin story. But my point or question, in the context of this last audience question about someone who arrived late and wanted to know what the Jefferson Rule was, how do you see Clinton and Obama fitting into this story of, I think you just told us how you see Obama. He was a perfect vehicle through which the message could be anything, right? That's how he was elected in 2008, change, a very abstract concept.
And hope.
Right, and hope. And certainly he's been more progressive than conservative in executing policy, sure, but it was Clinton who said the era of big government is over.
Yeah.
And so if that wasn't paying homage to Jefferson, I don't know what would be.
Well, I think what you see often, I mean, as much as I'm critical of both sides, they do differ. And what you see, they approach the Founding Fathers in different ways. And you see this with Obama, and you see this with the Tea Party. Conservatives tend to approach the Founding Fathers with a kind of fundamentalist literalism. That is, that the Founding Fathers had, and I don't mean that negatively, that they literally established fundamentals to the nation, and that it is, those fundamentals are unchanging, and that we need as much as possible to maintain those fundamentals, otherwise the nation goes into decline. You see, liberals, and this makes sense of Obama and also of Bill Clinton, you see them approaching it in a different way. That is, that the Founding Fathers established a certain set of principles, whether they believed it or not, whether they lived up to it or not, the principle of equality and liberty, for example, and that those principles change over time and grow in meaning divorced from the Founding Fathers themselves. And so in each instance, what you see is invocations of the founders, but they approach the Founding Fathers in different ways. And you see conservatives most often using the Founding Fathers to say we've departed from those principles and we need to go back. And you see liberals invoking the Founding Fathers as sort of establishing a set of ideals that we need to live up to in some ways. And in both cases, though, what you see is the Founding Fathers agree with whoever it is that's invoking them in the present. So even though they sort of use different interpretive roots, they wind up in basically the same place, which is the Founding Fathers agree with me, and that's why we should install my policy.
And I think we just have a couple more minutes, but for our audience, this is a terrific book. I think you'd enjoy it even if you are not a historian by training or like history books, because it's quite an exciting narrative. But finally, we said before Jefferson's quote, Benjamin Franklin joined free or die, but I'm always interested in the unsung kind of rule. If there was another, we mentioned Hamilton and Adams before. But in the process of writing this book, was there a founder whose
that I like?
Well, sure. was there a founder maybe who you like? Sure, yeah. But was there a founder who, was setting a rule that would breed flexibility as opposed to inflexibility?
And I was joking. Of course, I like all the founders. I wouldn't have spent 4 years of my life reading about them and their uses if I, didn't like them in some way. But I am asking, is there a founder that you naturally gravitate to? And I usually say Benjamin Franklin, and I say that not just because we're in Philadelphia, but because he's almost an apolitical founder. Like, it's impossible to use him in a kind of a politically meaningful way. What you think about the founder, what you think about Franklin, and it's sort of what I would like us to think about all the founders, is his unique individuality and his utter idiosyncrasy. Help me out there. Idiosyncrasy in his own time. And the thing about the Founding Fathers is, if you read very deeply into their papers, and I've read deeper than I might have imagined into their papers, is that they are all thoroughly unique people that when you kind of really wrestle with their uniqueness, when you kind of really recognize the degree to which they lived in a particular moment and that moment is now gone, I mean, it kind of, like all kind of people of the past, I'd love to know them, but I don't want to see them in political debate.
To be continued, maybe a Franklin rule. But for now, the Jefferson Rule, I encourage you all to pick it up. Thank you, David.
Thank you
for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Well, that was fun.
Wow, signing books. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I did.
Thanks for interviewing me.
Oh,
I appreciate
sure.
that.